The farthest back I'd had to look before to find testimony of cloning done earlier than what is publicly admitted to was Kate Griggs's 1998 testimony. They're cloning people. Those 3 or 4 words were buried in about 8 hours of video testimony. Now, I would think that in a supposedly constitutional country based on the right to live, that should be foremost in the number one thing someone should mention, that if a means of limited immortality and rebirth is being withheld from people, that should be the primary and number one issue that someone should bring up in testimony. I've seen an even more extreme example of this now with Cathie O'Brien's testimony. She mentions in her blog that there was discussion of cloning as an everyday sort of thing back in the 1980s. So that pushes the date back about 10 years, if that cloning was being done then, from the Kay Griggs testimony as to what the earliest time of cloning is. As I would see it, withholding life from people on a vast scale is an extreme crime, in that you're keeping life not only of a normal lifespan, but possibly several lifespans worth, or even an indefinite lifespan worth, that's being kept from people. So it's a passive but very devastating method of keeping people's lives short, and also a method of mentally controlling them. This is ironic that Cathie O'Brien doesn't mention this, since her book is entirely about mind control. And her second one, which she mentions as the source for this information, is from 2004, although she underwent the abuse in the 80s and wrote her first book about it and published it in 1995. I looked through several of her video presentations. So with Kay Griggs, it was 8 hours to find 3 or 4 words, whereas with Cathie O'Brien, it was 12 hours to find 1 word, supposedly, saying that George Bush Jr. supposedly. So she didn't even definitely say that there was cloning involved, but I did a search for George Bush clone and found that there is a book where the claim is made that the 43rd President George Bush was a clone of the 41st President of George Bush. If that were true, that would push the date of the earliest human cloning back to about 1945, when the 43rd President George Bush was conceived. There's a movie called She Who Must Be Obeyed, which presents this argument that having a long lifespan, which is withheld from everybody else, is itself a form of mind control. It's a type of intimidation. A visitor to this remote place that was ruled over by one immortal woman asks, she's only one, and she's only a woman, and you're men, you're stronger and you're more numerous, why don't you just overthrow her? Why do you obey her without question? And the answer is that it's her immortality, and it makes them think of her as unchanging, which is another method of intimidation. It's always been that way, it can't change, it's always going to be that way. And it seems to me then that someone who still thinks of cloning as something we should suppress, or that it's somehow wrong to want to have a young and healthy life, is still under mind control. I've seen this sort of thing, and Cathie O'Brien also has a negative attitude toward water and carbon dioxide, which are also symbolic youth treatments, ways of being young again. And so as with the oil industry and the UFO disclosures, as I've talked about in a previous video, these government whistleblowers, although they come out and reveal information on one level, still have very conservative attitudes that seem to be designed to keep people controlled in other subject areas, and particularly to do with the pursuit of youth and rejuvenation technologies. So what happens is you make one step forward and then another step back, or perhaps because these people are brave and coming out and saying what they're saying, nobody wants to question or say, why don't you want access to things that would make people young? Why do you still have these attitudes that anything connected with youth should be banned or suppressed. Now you can read her discussion on this. One of this, what I've always thought of as stereotypical and wrong objection to cloning is the assumption that a clone is somehow more mentally controllable than someone who's conceived without cloning. I don't see why this would be the case, and I would want an explanation if Cathie or other people think that clones are somehow more controllable. All the rumors of powerful people who seem to disappear and might reappear looking just slightly different, being clones, would imply that the powerful people are keeping cloning to themselves. If it were such a great control mechanism, why isn't it out there in the general public? There is an implication in the Bush administration, the second one, that there's sort of a rubbing people's noses in it by calling the second George Bush W, for one thing, implying that he's like a puppet, because to dub is to put one person's speech into another person's synchronized lip movements. So we hear the sound of one and the movements of the other. So there's a doubling going on there, but W, of course, is also a pun on to double, to W, George W. Bush, at least implying that the second one is a double of the first one, although they don't look exactly alike. But there are various rumors connected with the 43rd President George Bush that he might have been a double of some sort. And even if it's not true, it could still be a method of manipulation and control, because, as Cathie O'Brien points out in her blog, people write off things when they're actually a bigger threat. They say, oh, well, that person's just a clone. Well, it doesn't matter. In fact, it's worse. If you have 2 or 3 powerful evil people, that's worse than just one. and it adds to the intimidation factor that you can't get rid of these people, supposedly. So there are all these strange things that come up when people talk about cloning and that they haven't questioned and rewritten in their minds. So I would say it's the life control of the means of extending one's years of existence, and mind control go hand in hand. And if Cathie O'Brien is saying that the worst thing, the number one issue we face is mind control, I don't know if that's absolutely true, because in order to think as I see it, one must have an existence and a body and be alive. If we're out in some other sort of dimension, just living as vibrating beings or whatever, then maybe we don't have that to worry about anymore. So where we live, life is fundamental to all other rights, and I would see that the controlling of people's lifespans and the deliberate shortening of them to make them more manipulable, so that they won't remember everything that went on in the past, so that it's possible to re-educate them with every generation, change the past without every generation. That is something to be extremely cognizant of and aware of the threat of in dealing with the way that powerful people with hidden technologies wield control over everybody else.